Hey, I don't know if you know this at all. I'm going to tell you how bad some of your habits really are. The typical cell phone user touches his or her phone 2,617 times a day. Right? That's when you know you got a problem. Close to 3,000 times a day, and this is an average user. And this is I think it's a stat that's about 1.5 to 2 years old, and it's only gotten worse. They say that the typical time someone spends on social media apps, 2 hours and 23 minutes on social media apps every day. I don't know if you guys if you have an iPhone, or I know that even Android does it now. You can go on the time spent. Android calls it health awareness, and then Apple's got how much time you're spending. Even my 10-year-old, he's got this little iPod that we got him for Christmas, and he's on it. And sometimes I'm like, dude, you're on it for an hour and a half. I mean, where were your parents during this time, right? We spend this much time. Okay, the top five apps that users use in the first quarter of 2019 were WhatsApp, Messenger, TikTok. Who here's on TikTok, by the way? Who's on TikTok? Someone told me about TikTok, and I went to take a look at it, and I'm like, I don't get it. I felt super old. So WhatsApp, Messenger, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. And even though there's less and less people spending time on Facebook, it still trends as a pretty high, top 5, and it has been for years. So the other day, I was flipping through a news aggregator, basically, and I was looking, and it's I came across this one magazine ad, and it was the 7 apps that you need to delete off your phone right now. Okay. It's probably, if we spend this much time on our phones, we should probably know which apps should not be on our phones. And, it's interesting because I read this article after another article where it was talking about all the reasons why young adults and teenagers going into university and college age, whatever, why the rise in worry and anxiety and stress is growing. It's just because we have so much information now that there's so many more things to be worried about. They say that I think the stats on loneliness and anxiety have almost doubled in the last decade for people. And they say one of the biggest concerns is that a lot of young people are really worried about their privacy and what what apps are taking stuff from you, and where is it going, who's it being sold to, and all this jazz. And so I think if we're going to spend much time, we should probably know which one to do. So I'm I should flip on this and see what's going on. And here are some of them. Just Angry Birds is number 1. Angry Birds. Second is Gas Buddy. Yeah. What? No way, that's crazy. I'm out of here. You suck. Gas Buddy, because it knows your location and everything. It needs to take a lot of information from you to kind of know. IPv or IPVanish VPN, which is meant to secure your phone, but they say it actually doesn't at all. It's one of the worst apps you can have. Fourth, Facebook. I think we all knew this, but if you didn't know, out of the 5 top apps of 2019, Facebook owns 4 of them. WhatsApp, Messenger, Facebook, and Instagram. Okay? Yeah. Number 5, AgeFace. You know that app? A few months ago. I wonder what I look like when I'm 65 years old, right? It's oh, hells no, turn that off, right? Some of you look pretty good old, actually, and they say, though, it was one of the worst things you could have done because it takes so much information from you. 6th is this thing called Cam Scanner, where you can scan a document, and it turns it into a fax or something like that for you. So they said it's worse. Probably none of you use it. Maybe a few of you do. But the seventh, which is a little surprising to me, okay, the 7th one that they say, and this is by Popular Mechanics, saying you need to delete off your phone right now, is the YouVersion Bible app. Right? Crazy. If you're unfamiliar with this app, because you're Bible, why is that on my phone, right? If you're this is the most downloaded and used Bible in the world. and has been for years. It's installed on over 300 million phones. And apparently knows a lot about you. Ironically, the Bible knows something about you. I don't know how to feel about that. I'm like, is it wrong or is it right? And they just say that it asks you for a lot of information. And of course, the people who made it, they're like, oh, no, we need it to, make sure your experience is really good. And like, okay, right? Anyways. We've been in this series called Jesus Is, and in August we sent out this, we put out this kind of ad, this promo on Instagram and Facebook. We're like, tell us who you think Jesus is. We had hundreds of responses, and we really wanted to, in September, get an idea of who Jesus is. If we were to kind of strip everything away, who do we see Jesus is? Is he all these things you think he is? And all those on that, if you watch the trailer, and you see it sometimes on our Instagram, you'll see it on here, those are all like part of the responses that we got. We didn't make any of them up. And so we thought, let's do a series in September that's kind of a given idea of who Jesus actually is. Honestly, when it comes to the project, Jesus is the most important figure here. And who is he, though? Can you know him? And the project, we really just think it's important that you kind of get the brass facts of it, that we're not going to hide anything. There's no hidden agenda. We just want you to have some sort of introduction to who Jesus is. And so the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about who Jesus is. Jesus is honest. Last week was Jesus is joy. This week is a little bit different. Jesus is safe. Now, this is why I bring it up. I listen to a few podcasts, probably some of you too. I guess it's like a lot of people listen to podcasts now, and one by this it's called Reply All. I don't know if you listen to it. It's such an interesting podcast by Gimlet Media. Anyways, I'm not an ad. It's just good. It kept coming out of my mouth. Anyways, there's this one podcast. It's called Snapchat Thief. If you ever want to be scared of touching your phone ever again, go ahead and listen to this podcast. It starts with this girl, this story of she's like, all of a sudden she got this email saying, hey, listen, if you want access to your Snapchat account, you got to pay me some money. And if you don't, I'm going to release all your nudies, right? And she's like, I had a few of those, right? And so she's like, what do I do? And she calls them up and they do this whole thing and they explain how easy it is to take over people's social media accounts and how they buy it. And there's this whole dark web where you can go and purchase people's login info. And a lot of it is based on some of your usernames, that if they want your username, they do anything they can to buy it off. It is such a scary podcast to listen to. And it's I literally at that point, I installed some VPNs, I installed some password managers. I was oh no, it's gonna, I told my wife, I'm get off your phone, right? I was we gotta change all this. People are trying to steal our information, right? And it's weird. I actually, this last 2 years, I had my bank account and my credit card compromised. There is an idea, and it changes the way I view tech and I see tech and how I use it. And here's the thing. I actually honestly think that there are some people who feel unsafe with God. I think it's because there's this idea that he knows a lot about you. Kind of like these apps. They know a lot about you. And at first you don't mind until something is compromised and you're oh my goodness, who's going to know now? Who's going to see the things I don't want them to see? Who's going to know the things I don't want them to know? And there's this idea that Jesus, we say even 2 weeks ago, so Jesus is honest. He knows who you are. He knows kind of, he's not surprised about stuff that's going on in your life. And you're okay, that's cool. Then you're wait. He knows how much? And it can feel unsafe. And you know how I know this? Because some of you who especially maybe grew up in the church, and maybe you just started following Jesus recently, some of you refuse to eat until you pray because you think it'll just be poisoned, right? It's God's up there going, you didn't pray, right? And he's just have fun with your diarrhea, right? We have, this idea that's what he's going to do. And needless to say, you of course, no matter what you're eating, right? It's some of you, it's make this Big Mac super healthy, and, or just we don't do that. Or some of you are maybe you've been walking for a while, or maybe you don't know Jesus, and there's this idea of going, oh my goodness, I haven't really talked to him, I haven't really done much, and so I kind of would rather stay away, because how do you engage with someone in a sense that maybe you feel there's a bit of an offense? It doesn't feel safe. And at that point, it doesn't matter how honest Jesus is it actually safe? And that's sometimes our view of Jesus. And I think there's a lot of us, including myself, who have multiple times felt like Jesus is not safe because of how much he supposedly knows about me. Is Jesus actually safe? What does he do with all? Is he going to use things against me? What about my sexuality? What about my doubts? What about the things? What about whatever I become? And what if I go down the road and I realize that things are not turning out the way that I think he wants me to turn out? Like, is that a safe space to land? And honestly, there's so many people I think who maybe start a relationship with Jesus and they kind of move away from it because they think, I've done too much, I've gone too far. Like, how do we approach Jesus? Is he safe? There's this story of this woman in the Bible and in the book of John. So there's like 4 stories of Jesus' life: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they kind of give you the story of Jesus' life and his words and stuff like that. And there's this one story that like captures a lot of people's it captures their heart. Because I mean, it's such an incredible story, but it's kind of born out of something terrible. It says that there is these religious leaders who found this woman who was caught in adultery, like literally in the act of adultery. And there was a very this was kind of an era, this first century, where the guys kind of ruled the way things went. It was unfair to women especially. So you notice that in this story, none of the guys were dragged out. But it says, as he was speaking, their teachers of religious law and Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. They put her in front of the crowd. Could you imagine? Think of the worst position. Think of even just being on the toilet and someone rushing in and dragging you out in front of the crowd with your pants down. You're like, right? Like, this is the most compromising situation this woman could have been in. And they bring her out and they're like, listen, Jesus, you know what the law says? We get to stone her. Which tells you about their mentality that they're okay with this. And they're trying to catch Jesus in this. And it's funny, it says that Jesus, at this point, kind of bent down and drew something in the sand, in the dirt. It doesn't tell us what it is. He gets up and he's like, listen, whoever you who has never sinned in your life, go ahead and stone her. And it says from the oldest person to the youngest, they all drop their stones and kind of walk away. And then he bends down and he writes something else in the dirt. And then he only has this one response to this woman. He basically is like, where's all your accusers? Like, they've all gone. It's just you. And Jesus says, well, neither do I. Now go and sin no more. And here's what I want you to notice about this. You notice that in none of this, Jesus dragged out this compromising situation for this woman. In the most compromising place you could have been, Jesus isn't like, okay, well, tell me about all your sins in front of everybody. In fact, so much so that even in this story, we have no idea what Jesus wrote in the sand. People have tons of ideas about it, but no one knows. There is a sense of privacy that was given to this woman because I think what he's trying to do with every one of us, his goal is to restore your dignity, is to restore your personhood as someone who's highly loved by him. And so these religious leaders, let's call it sometimes the church, drags out someone's sin and they're like, look at what they've done. Look at who you are. And Jesus is like, okay, well, let's do this. If you're going to drag her sins out, let's drag your sins out. They're like, no, I'm good. I'm going to backstep this, right? Right? And they kind of rewind their way out of there. And Jesus is like, listen, basically this woman, I'm not going to accuse you. But know that you don't have to be defined by this moment or what you did. Go and change. That's a big thing. We talk a lot in church about Jesus changing people's lives. I think that's part of our concern about what is he going to ask me to change. Again, the things that are wrong in me is he going to use against me. I'll get into this and Jesus is like, man, it's so good. Jesus loves me the way I am. And there's even some songs about it. And there's this gospel story of being happy with Jesus. And he's like, all right, now that you're here, let's sit down and let me tell you about what's really going to happen. So you did this wrong and that wrong. You kind of don't fit in this way. Is that going to happen? Is he going to begin using this against me? And I think that's where some of our fear comes from. Is he going to use me against myself? And this story shows us that I don't think that's the way it is, but let's go a step further. Near the beginning of Jesus' story in life, he had these people following him, and it was pretty early in his, I guess you can say his ministry, early in his teaching life. He was around 30 when he started, so if you're still looking for a career, don't worry. Jesus had to wait till he was 30, so you got some time, all right? And He's 30 near the beginning of it. All these people following him, and they're asking him, it's like, hey, how are we supposed to approach God? They ask him. Teach us to pray. Basically, teach us to approach him. Because their understanding at this point was they were used to the feeling and the weight of being like unworthy. They weren't the kinds of people that you would find like people asking advice from about spiritual things or anything like that. So like, how do we approach God? Like, you seem to have this voice of God and you're hanging out with us, but how do we like approach like the big guy, right? Like, how does this work? Because we're not the kind of people. Where do we start? And it's funny because it's not typically where you think Jesus says. He's like, I want you to start in the dark. He's like, when you pray or when you go to speak with God, when you approach him, go away by yourself, shut the door behind you, and pray to your Father in private. Go to the dark. And you're like, well, isn't that where people get murdered? The dark, right? How many of you have been in a vehicle and you're driving with your friend and you know your best friends, but you're going to like this scary bushed area and you're like, one of us are going to die tonight. Why do you go to the dark? That's scary. But here's what he's trying to get across. No, what he's trying to mean is like, go to a place that's private, that's intimate. Go to a place that's safe. And remember, these people are used to like not being the kind of people you find in religious circles. They know they've got some story behind them. They have the people who are asking, is he going to use this stuff against me? And he's like, listen, kind of like what he did to this woman, I want you to go someplace safe. And I'll say it this way. So there were a number of years in my life where I intentionally walked as far away as I could from anything that has to do with God. I deconstructed like everything I really thought I believed and all that stuff. And I just like I wasn't just like wandering away. I was like trying to outpace myself, right? Like month after month. I wanted to run away as far as I could. And like for a couple years, I remember this one moment. I was in this situation, and it was in a service at a church, and I was so done. And this unsuspecting moment happened where I feel like the whole room kind of shut out, and someone began to sing something, and I was just like, I felt like this overwhelming embrace of God's love that totally healed and reorientated my soul. There was this private moment that for me, in the most compromising spiritual place I could have been, there wasn't a, hey, you're doing it wrong, you idiot. Like there was none of that. It was a whole embrace of, I know. But I still have you. And here's something I learned in that moment. That God longs for us in the dark, private places because sometimes that's the only place where you feel safe. It's the only time where you feel, I gotta tell people, everyone has to have a safe place to be unsafe. And what you get out of this exchange is not someone who, download this app and I'll know everything about you and I'll use it against you. Maybe sell it to a few other people. No, he's like, would you come into this private place? And here's the thing, the context for this private place that he's talking about is like a supply room. It was the only room in like a poor Palestinian would have had. And it would have been locked, the only room kind of locked, AKA it was the safest place in the house, AKA was the 2002 thriller Panic Room with Jodie Foster, right? Like, I mean, this is the kind of place it would have been. It was the safest place in the room. And Jesus is basically saying to them and saying to us, he will be found in the dirtiest, poorest places of your life. He's not scared to go there. In fact, not only here's the thing, we always think that when we go to those places, then Jesus is like, oh, like, I'll come down now. And it says that he's waiting there in the safest place in your life. Not where we pretend like we have it all together, but where we know where we don't. We're too scared to go. Here's what I've learned. He transforms us from a safe relationship. Not for a safe relationship. that this change that happens in every single, listen, if you have a relationship with Jesus, something in your life is going to change. But the change comes from a safe place. It's not so that you become safe with him. And that is what I've learned, like this idea of embrace, this concept of like when you can be open with who you are and find safety, there's almost this freedom and there's almost this idea where like God comes into those spaces and he's safe. And a lot of us has this thing where like we got to do something right, we got to be something right in order to be safe with God, to approach him safely. But he's like, no, like I've made a safe place. Whatever I do in you will always be safe. It's not going to violate you. It's not going to violate your privacy. It's not going to violate who you are. He made who you are, and he's like, I want you to come to know that I am the safest place you can be. I am safe. And he was speaking in contrast to what they would have known. He says, when you pray, don't babble on as the Gentiles do, those who didn't know God. They think their prayers are answered merely by repeating the words again and again. He's like, don't be like them. Don't be like the religious people who go out into the public and try to look all spiritual. Don't be like those people who try to make amends with the deity and don't know who to pray to, and they just think of everything. I was like, don't be like those people. Don't try to make a safe space for me. I've already made it. Go into the dark. Some of you need to know that your relationship with God, it starts and it needs to always continue from that dark place. A place where you're safe with God. And no matter how compromising a situation you're in, he's like, would you come? You're safe. But he goes further. See, at this point, he was actually teaching, like I said, how to pray. We haven't even gotten to the prayer yet. And the first few words are actually as far as we're going to get into the prayer today. Because they're so powerful that it's easy to gloss over, but we really shouldn't. So he not only says, I want you to go to the safe space. Not only is he saying, like, I am safe. Come into that place. And he says, like, when you go there, that's where you're going to find me. In fact, there's a promise attached to that. He's like, that's where you'll find blessing. That's where you'll find peace. That's where you find goodness. That's where you'll find me. Go into the private place. Don't try to make something out of who you are and who you're not. He says this, when you pray, when you approach me, so no matter who you are in this room, when you go to approach God, whether you're running away from him right now or you don't know anything about him, this is how you approach him. Pray like this, our Father. Now, when he says the word our, he's passing on to us, listen to this, he's passing on to us the same relationship he has with God. He's basically saying, hey, listen, when you're going to talk with God, I want you to know, you say, our Father. He's saying that God is yours. The relationship I have with the Father, you have, it's a possessive pronoun, meaning that God the Father not only has us, not only does he in a sense own us, not in a bad way, but not only is he ours, but he gives himself to us so that he is ours. In this simple word, our, is really the joy of the entire gospel. It's that, like, do you think maybe Jesus feels safe in prayer? Like, I mean, you walk around a guy, and have you ever met someone who like seemed to have it all together, and you're like, this person probably has like a wicked prayer life. You know, there's jokes, it's like, hey, say a prayer to me so the big guy hears it, right? You know, and, you know, because that's not me. Jesus would have been like the pinnacle of that. But he says this, the same safety I have in relationship with God is the same relationship of safety you have, our Father. As much as he's mine, he's yours. It's not predicated on what you've done, and more importantly, who you'll become. It'll always be a place where if you approach him, you know you can approach him as yours, just like Jesus viewed him. But he moves on. Then he says, Father. It is known as the most warm of the Aramaic words for father, and it's Abba. Like, you think about it. If you knew you did something wrong to somebody, or maybe you did something right, really good, and you got to kind of keep up with it, how do you approach someone that way? Whether you're walking on eggshells or like you've just not screwed up yet. You want to save face. That's when you begin. I always think about like whenever I go back to Ottawa, it's not very often, but I go back and I visit some of my friends and I see their parents and I'm like, they know all the dumb things I did when I was young. And so I'm like, hello, Mr. Waggett, how are you? I have changed. Here's all the things I've done with my life since that moment that I almost burned the church down, right? Twice. And so you go to this kind of sense of like, I just want to know, like, I've changed. I'm pretty good now, right? Like, I've got a family. I got 3 kids. They're a little screwed up, but I mean, it's pretty normal. Like, we know who I am, right? And like, how do you address them? And so you think, like, coming to God, it's, and sometimes it is. It's like, do I like have my hands folded a certain way? Do I kneel down? Do I do like a, how do I do this? How do I approach him, Mr. God? Or Mrs.? I don't know. Like, how do I approach this? See, the people at this time who maybe they would call the pagans, basically those who were really Jewish at this point, they would actually plead as many names as possible of the gods they were entreating, hoping that at least one would be effective at some point. They didn't know. They didn't know the access and what kind of access they had. And so at this point in the first century, they would have just used anything, just to make sure maybe one of them works. So let's just pray all the names that we have for him, just in case. Jesus tells us, though, you use one, because it is the best understanding of the kind of God that you are praying to and how he wants you to know him and approach him, and that is as Father. Now, I know some of you in this room have not had a really good example of what a father is. And so maybe it's a bit of a loaded term. Let me give you a bit of historical context here. For a first century Palestinian, or in first century Palestine, I should say, a father was understood as someone who the children would be totally dependent on as strong providers. That's the context here. They were fathers who not only loved their children, but whose job it was to seek their children's good. See, at this point, children had zero status in culture, zero status. They were fully dependent on the father to provide everything they needed. They were fully dependent on finding out what's passed down to them and things like that. And so a child was dependent, but it was a loving father. And at this point, so I know that some of you have not had, but this is, the context here is of a really, really, in fact, there's a few other times where Jesus is like, who, being a good father, would withhold from their son or daughter something that they want? Would they give them a snake instead of bread? And he was giving comparisons to this. And he's saying, when he says father, he means it in the most intimate way you possibly can understand it. God is a father who is personal, who is intimate, who is known, who is active, who is protective, who is for us, who is safe. There is literally not a more intimate term Jesus could have used to help you understand the relationship that you and I have with God. You need to hear that. There is no more intimate term Jesus could have used to describe the kind of relationship you have with God. One way, Father. This means also that you and I are not just random individuals, Christians or anyone who longs to connect with God. They are sons and daughters. In fact, it's repeated throughout the rest of the New Testament, even in the Old Testament, so the first half of the Bible and the second half. In this book called Romans, Paul writes, you've received God's Spirit when he adopted you as his own children. Now we call him Abba, Father. This book called Galatians, it says, for you are all children of God through faith in Christ Jesus. And you're like, okay, so if I'm not a Christian, I'm not a child of God, well, that kind of sucks. Let me just try to explain something very simply to you. No, not really. This is what it means. Those who've come into a relationship with God understand that from the get-go, from creation, you were created in his image as his kids, as his children. Becoming a Christian is just coming to the awareness that that has always been the case. This is why the project exists. We challenge people, listen, there's 150,000 young adults in Edmonton. Most of them don't know Jesus. Who's the one person in your life you could be praying for so that they would come into awareness that they have this relationship with God if they want it? It's not like it's withheld. It's a relationship of, would you receive? So who's that person you've been praying for? Who's the person you've been believing for and imagining a preferred future for? That one person in your life who doesn't know Jesus yet. Because they need to know that the relationship they can have with God starts with that one word, Father. Because we're his kids. I know this is a bit of a harder thing to understand. Maybe I should just share one more personal story. When I lost my dad a number of years ago, it was 10 or so years ago, I can't remember. A terrible son. But anyways, I lost my dad, and I remember I went to go see a counselor, and I was really struggling with some big decisions in my life. I didn't really know how to make the decision. My dad had always kind of been there, and I was so stressed and anxious. And he's like, okay, explain to me, like, what if you made a wrong decision? How would your dad have responded? He's like, he would have been like, that's okay. Like, don't worry, your life's not over. Like, he would have been gracious. He would have been kind. And I know I was lucky to have a good dad. I get that. And he was a good dad. And I was explaining, he'd probably like, even if I did make a mistake, he's like, that's all right. It's fine. Come home. It's cool. We'll figure it out. He's like, wow, your concept of your dad seems a lot nicer than your concept of God. He kind of flipped the tables on me. And he's like, why do you think God would be any different? Those things we long for in a good father, those things that kind of we know needs to be right, even if you've been raised in a bad home and you're like that, I don't want to be like that because I know that's not right. That is an inkling. That's a breadcrumb to what you were created for, to have a relationship with a father, with God himself, that he is a good father who looks after you. When you mess things up, he's not like, oh my goodness, myself, what am I going to do? How is this going to work out? He's like, no, would you come home? I am safe. I am good. I am for you. That is the relationship that you can assume you have with God all the time. Why? Because Jesus is safe. You look through Jesus' life, the people who would have felt the most unsafe found their safest spots with Jesus. That's what you find over and over again in his story. And the way we see Jesus, the reason why Jesus came was to be a picture of how we need to understand God. Safe. Yes, Jesus will transform you. You will change. But because that's what happens when you feel safe. Paul, in another letter in this book called Galatians, he says, you received the Spirit because you believe the message you heard about Jesus. How foolish can you be? After starting your new lives in the Spirit, what are you now trying to become perfect by your own human effort? You can't do it. He's given you the safe space already. Some of you have been running. Some of you have been scared. Some of you think Jesus is too unsafe for the reality of your life, your questions, your doubts, the things that you've been told are wrong about you. Some of you are running away, and Jesus says, what I'm asking you to do is just call me Father. Call me Father. I'm safe. Go to a private place where it maybe feels like the most safe place for you. Go to that place. Speak. I will embrace you. I will pour my love on you. And you may change, not because I need you to change, but because that's what good love does. It changes you, transforms you. Jesus is safe. Here's what we're going to do tonight. This may be a little awkward for you tonight, but I want to challenge you. We're going to give you 1 minute in the dark. I don't know what's going on in your life. I got no idea what's going on in your head, but Jesus is saying, would you come into the dark place and know that I'm there waiting for you? And I always say, whatever's in your head is kind of the place to start. We're going to give you 1 minute. My prayer is that you would sense God hearing you and speaking to you. But if you just need to get things off your chest, if you just need to be alone for that 1 minute, that's what we want to give you tonight. And then I'll come back and I'll close this thing off. But let's go into this 1 minute. And I encourage you, don't move. It'll be awkward. Close your eyes. Even if you don't have a relationship with Jesus, it doesn't matter to him. He desires a relationship with you. So even through all your doubts, through all your mess, through everything you think you're not, would you just, in this moment, know that you are safe? Go ahead. 1 minute. Lord, my prayer for every single one of us, all the time, whether people here know you or don't know you, God, that they would know that we can assume that relationship, the relationship that is the most intimate, that God, even in the dark places of our lives, that you are still safe, that you're for us, that you love us, that it's finding you in that place where you do your best work. Whether we feel like our sins are dragged out before people or just dragged out in our own lives in front of the ways that we just wished wasn't. It's in that place where you say, would you stand up and know you are loved? And I don't define you by what you've done. I define you by what I have done for you. You are my child. I am your dad. I love you. I pray, Holy Spirit, in this moment, that those who need that moment would sense you overcoming them and overwhelming them, that every single one of us would sense that, God. And as we approach you, we know we can approach you like we're your kids. And you're the greatest dad. Amen. You can bring the lights back up, guys. If you're here and you didn't know that that is who Jesus is, and you just have questions about Jesus and what this looks like, I encourage you to text the word NEXT to 555-888. You're going to get this text. It's a digital booklet. It's anonymous. You can just take a look at it. You can start your relationship. There's a lot of you, over 120 since January have texted this, and over 55 of those have gone through the process of making a change in their life. That's incredible. But it started just with one text, and I encourage you to start there.